Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to Printlandia, the place where we do lots of prints and we do lots of cleanup and we do lots of fun things. So, as you can see, I got a lot of stuff I got to discuss today. We're just gonna gloss over a few things, and then I'll probably have a video for some other crazy guys. But without further ado, let's initially talk about some of the 3D prints that I was doing. Move that out of the way. Alright. So, I did these figures here as a test print. We did 0.4 millimeters, 0.2 millimeters, 0.1 millimeters, and I sliced them all out exactly the same settings with a new roll of material, and then I printed them. Lovely enough, I have results which tells me that I've got to make some setting changes. All these were using the standard settings for my printer with the standard settings for most of the materials. Unfortunately, when I first got started printing, I noticed that there were striations in the prints right around here. And so what happened was is that these were bands were appearing in random spots and then disappearing. And this was at the 0.4 millimeter test print, which to me says that this was not hot enough. And this was at the standard 200 degrees Celsius. And so with every new roll of film, you got to go ahead and do at least one little test print just to make sure your materials are dialed in for that material, because every brand and every little batch is needed. Turns out this roll is a very inconsistent roll of gray, and because it was a general, just a very, very inexpensive generic roll of gray PLA. There we go. Alright, so this one, the roll of temperature said it was 195 degrees to 220 degrees. At 200 degrees, this should be melting just fine. Unfortunately, it was not. And I could tell that on the very bottom here. And I don't know if this is showing up properly, but right here there's very smooth, consistent areas, and then it goes to rough, incomplete fills, and it does that over and over and over again, which tells me the roll was the nozzle was hot. Yeah, nozzle was hot, and then it cooled off to the point where it couldn't work properly, and as it was heating back up again, it would then go smooth. So hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold. And that completed everywhere else. Hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold. And so it made for a very inconsistent spool, but also a very fragile one. So, doing my test prints, ramped it up to 205, 210, 215, and it printed fine. And as a result, just as I suspected, this guy right here being as a 0.4, I saw every single one of these supports on the inside of here match up with every single one of these extruded bump lines, except for the seam here, which I was expecting. But it's all the way up through the head and the whole 9 yards. It had a big old peanut butter and jelly sandwich effect, where it just squishes out and then pillows out into the next layers. So that's something to be said. Other than that, this one printed out just fine. I mean, this is a fantastic print. It's rough, but it works. So I don't have much to say about that one. The next couple prints were where I started encountering some issues that related to the heat, and probably the speed, and a couple other things. This one was the 0.2, and it printed fine all the way up to this thin crown, which, as you can see, is very thin and wispy. And this is why I print this guy whenever I'm making these guys for my 3D modifies. Just because sometimes this will show me a lot of things that the other things won't, and plus I don't care about the crown. So as it reached up to a certain point across the bar here, it then spaghettified and turned into that right there. And it's very fragile. Let's see if I can. So it's very fragile. There's nothing there. And I couldn't figure out exactly why it did that. I figured it might have just been a fluke. But I had to proceed with the test here. Everything else is fine. It still has some layer shifting, but it's not like a layer support exposure. But nothing too bad. I don't see any sort of haloing. The texture on this is good. The seam is not that pronounced. I did notice that between all of these prints that the foot was a little bit wider than the base. It should have been straight up and down. So that tells me that there was this elephant footing was from a hot heat bed, which at the default was 60 degrees Celsius. So I had to decrease that down to 50. And I did that after I did this next test. This one is the 0.1. The crown completely disappeared. But the texture on it, phenomenal. Smooth, not a lot of like excess toothing. Didn't have really any issues in it. There was one little slight defect, but I think that was just a little bit of a gum, like a little bit of a gooper on the nozzle. But other than that, this is a perfect fit, except for the crown, which had that spaghettified effect. So, this comes from two things. One, too much heat. I was at 215 degrees Celsius for the printing. Could also be the speed. Could also just be the fact that this was improperly sliced to be too thin on this area here. The next option would also be that there was an issue with the printing filament with adhesion. But I don't see that anywhere on a consistent body area, only where it skips from one piece to another. So that required me to do a 3D test. And these are benchmark tests, they're everywhere. There's nothing special about this one. This one is just one that is just meant for an overhang, but it also has like all these little pieces. Lets me know all the basic issues here. From this, I have no real droopage on the supports. My verticals are pretty good and clean, and everything else is pretty good. And I did notice that the text was blurring together. That's the temperature thing. Everything is all just extruded a little bit too hot, and so it sort of like squishes out a little bit too much into the areas there, and you lose definition. That also led into seeing these little fingers appear all over everything. In particular, these fingers right here. And what these fingers are is the length of the nozzle from the tip of the nozzle to the heating element. And that was the same on both of these overhangs. And every single time there was one of those guys, there was a little degree of spider webbing and spaghettification on there. Especially on the thin parts right here. By the time it reached up to the top here, where it had more time to go across, this disappeared a whole bunch. So it was only on these thinner parts. Which leads me to believe that because it was heating up so fast, it was so hot, that as it left, it would start to cool down as it pulled up a little bit, and then pop out of the tip, which then leaves a little gap going into the next layer across the board, and it causes that skittering across there. Leaves for a weak edge, and these just snap right off. And as for the overhang at 75 degree overhang, that's when I started seeing droopage, which is really not bad at all, considering there's no support for that. So these settings are pretty good. So my next one was just a test of heat. So I dropped the heat down to 205 degrees and left the speed at the default setting of 50 millimeters per second. And it still has some spaghettification, which is still there, but the whole crown is there, even though this and the 0.1 are the same settings. The only difference was temperature. 215 degrees, 205 degrees. So, with that being done, I then had to do the other test. I grabbed this guy right here, is supposed to be doing a whole nother figure, and 5 hours worth of time to do these two figures. I did another crown. And this one I did at 205 degrees at 40 millimeters per second. And this guy came out perfect. I still had some little fingers on some of the smallest parts. I still lose some little definition on the very, very tips of here. But I still got all of the parts of the crown done. Alright, so with this test done, this is one of the best dial-ins that I've had in a while with the shortest turnaround time, because there's only like 2 dial-ins that I had to do. I still have some finger little extrusions that were appearing on this stuff, but there's not much I can do with that. That comes with the material, because this is a very cheap, inexpensive PLA. So sometimes that just happens. It's not like it's one of those nice silk PLAs. You know, it's not like a nice silk PLA where I know I didn't have any of these issues with this one. This is just a standard gray, nothing PLA. There are some little minor inclusions that I can tell, and certain things that came from the quality of the line. I can't change that. That's part of the material. So the next part in was the supports, because I know that when I'm seeing material differences here, I'm going to see it with supports. Plus, I needed to figure out how I was going to do a larger piece, and that came. By the way, these guys are exactly the same thing as those guys, except for these are fantastic. So these are going to be perfect for me to sculpt with my 3D pen, or just being able to take some extra material, some extra leftover material, and being able to add to it and do some fun things with. Alright, so that led to these guys right over here. Now, what do I say about this guy? This guy's an older sculpture, and this guy just finished. So, on one of the hottest days of the month. So, I have certain issues here that came just straight from the heat of the day. So, I'll go over that when I get to the pull on the next video. But I did do some support work, because I needed to figure out how this needed to sit. Because this is an older model, and I know that there was no distinct bottom. This is a perfect example of probably needing a raft, because when I printed this guy first, it sat right there, and it made a big flat spot. Also, because of the amount of overhang that I had, which was a good solid fifth of my print, was above the 70 degree mark, which leads back to this test right here. 70 degrees, I saw 75 degrees. I saw overhang that was drooping without supports. With supports, this had no help. So, at 1 millimeter, 0.1 millimeters for the support gap, I knew I might encounter issues. And so of course I did. I mean, this is about the cleanest I got it without doing some manual grinding and stuff like that, just so I could show you how my tree support basically stuck to the very bottom of this, just because it was aggressive. The supports hit the eyeballs, and they stuck on the tongue. Wasn't too bad up anywhere else, just right here. So I had to increase the spacing on that one. I eventually ended up going with 0.15 and doing another test print at a smaller one, so I'd have much more chance for errors. And it came out looking a whole lot better. I've subsequently tried to start grinding it down a little bit. Did a little bit of manual hand filing, and you see it's like a matte smoothness here. Did some heat smoothing with my tools. Over here, doing some extra grinding. With something like this, you don't want to grind too much, because you never know entirely how thin you are on such a thin piece. So, as opposed to removing subtractively, working additively, or working distributionally. Sometimes it requires a little bit of all three. So here was complete filing, because I knew this was one of the smoothest areas that there was. There's very little toothing here. I only had some rough spot here and some extraneous little bits that came and stuck on there. Here, there was a whole lot of this, but not nearly as bad as that. And so, once I started grinding most of it down, once I get to where near the body is, then I have to start doing what would be considered redistribution form of sculpting, which with if we're going by clay, and this is the closest thing I can get to clay, when you start with a sculpture and you start putting clay in layers, the actual sculpt is additive. If I had a hole, I'd patch it, and that would be an additive patch. Subtractive would be removing it from this subject. Redistribution would be taking what's there and moving it around and making sure it becomes part of the new piece. You might see that in like wheel throwing, or even just taking it and doing scored additions, where you take sections and you score it just to smooth it and redistribute that clay into other areas. That's basically what you end up doing. So I'll be doing that a lot with this piece. These two pieces, I'm going to clean these guys up and just do a little speed clean, because I've been doing that with this guy. This is my one ABS print. Now I won't be showing you guys a video of this guy because this is something with ABS. There's a lot of fuming when I do this, and so I do this one with high ventilation. This little office here doesn't have the proper ventilation to be doing what I'm doing here. If you notice, there's some carbon scoring, which comes from as my tool heats up to the point there, and a little bit of stuff remains on the tip, and then it transfers into there. I'm not too worried about that because I can grind that down. But this one is reusing a few things. This is where it shattered, so I had to build a new support inside of it and build it up all the way to the outside. And then I do a little bit of grinding, a little bit of redistribution, a little bit of heat added, a little bit of heat smoothing, a little bit more additive work, a little bit more grinding. So there's a lot of back and forth to get that to be where it is. And you can start to see where I'm getting to that nice clean look. It'll just take a little bit of time to replace the parts that were so gross. On the other side, these guys, they're pretty much straightforward. They're just patching it in, throwing a bead across there with my pen tool, and then just taking my wood burning tool, which I can set down to 200 degrees Celsius, and just smoothing it and working this into a new layer of material, and then I'll just be grinding it down and smoothing it back out again. Same thing with the bottom. Did the same thing here. Just a lot of grinding, smoothing, adding, so replacing some of the funkiness from the 99 to 70 degree curving that I saw with all this growtiness there. But this is pretty smooth, and I like how this texture is. So other than that, this piece is close to being ready. And as for ABS, fantastic. Because the issues I saw here also appeared in here for heat. So I was able to prepare a little bit for what I saw. Just a little bit of what I saw here. Let me show you guys. Alright, remove my support here. Oop. Pop an eyeball off. I'm going to try to baby that and keep that on long enough for me to do a new patch on it. Alright. Move this down the side of the face. Alright, so today was the hottest day. In the 30 hours it was printing, I started it last night and printed all the way up to around 2 o'clock, where the heat of the day was right here in this time zone from here to here. And I see the striations on the lips, I see it in some of these layers in here, I see it on the eye. Got too hot. The same problem we had here. And I knew I was going to encounter that, because I went ahead and threw this into a stress test, and I had the same stress test marks here that these lines had at the same times that I would have had there. And then here is where I lost power. My circuit breaker for my AC unit blew because of the small storm, and this room got a little too hot, and the last bits of this sort of got a little too hot, and it spidered onto the outside here. Not all the way through, so it's not porous, just the outer layer. So I will have to be doing some cleanup. But this guy's not too bad. This guy literally has some of the best supports I did, because I dialed it in for these little guys, and I knew with a much bigger print it would just be an easy enough to pop off print versus one I had to basically grind down. Let's get this guy down and see how this guy popped out from here. Now this one I did a raft because, like I said, this was touching the bed. This one was not. This one I didn't have that flat spot. So I have a raft. It added on an extra, I believe, 10 minutes of print time, but the results should be a little bit better. Yank the raft back. Oop, lost the eye. I did not baby it. Alright, so yeah, that's going to take me a little bit of time to clean up. This is a good raft here. Or this is a good support structure on here. So this is going to take me a while to clean up. Like I said, I'm probably going to lose these eyes here, so I'll have to basically do to this what I did with that. But these aren't too big, so it should be easy enough for me to fix. If this was if I was going to do this as a professional model that I would constantly be making copies of, these eyes would probably be separate with a little geometric key fitting, so they would, that way whenever they printed, I'd just be printing them and gluing them, epoxying them into place. But considering this was an old model, I just threw this in here just for posterity's sake, just to see how well it would print. That's what we're going to work with. So, alright, my next video will just be something where I'm going to be cleaning up pieces. First I'll be starting with these guys, and then I'll probably go over the finished full piece here. Meanwhile, I'll be having some other prints going. I got to take this guy and print a large version of this guy out, and I may or may not doing that. I have a few more new videos as well for sculpts that I'm working on, so once I finish those guys out, I'll do the speed sculpts of those. And other than that, if you have any questions or comments about some of the processes here, let me know. And I will have a couple videos where I take these guys and I start to do some of my additive sculpting work on them, along with some of the cleanup work, and then making them look more than just a 3D sculpted print. And I'll have a couple videos of those guys. So with that, more later.